Come on. All right, we're gonna finish up chapter 6 today. There's a lot of descriptive stuff. I'm gonna leave it to you guys to read them. Today, I'm gonna primarily talk about real versus nominal returns, uh, taxes on bond returns, basically pre-tax and after-tax. You want to compare bond yields only on an after-tax basis. If you have bonds, one of them is not taxable at the federal level, the other is. You can't compare just their pre-tax yields. And we're going to talk about determinants of yield curve, also known as the term structure of interest rate, which basically means a yield curve is a graph where on the horizontal axis you have time to maturity, on the vertical axis you have yield to maturity. For example, 30-year yields are close to 4% these days. On the other hand, 5-year yields are about what 3.8. You know, what sort of things affects those structures? Let's talk about real versus nominal. Let's define first uh, nominal return or yield. We typically use the capital letter R to designate that. These are yields or returns before you take inflation into account. If you have $300 now and the bond that you bought is going to pay you 10% yield, well, next year you're going to have $330. So that extra 30 is nominal dollar return, or 10% is the nominal rate. We're going to designate inflation rate with the Greek letter pi, or small case Greek letter pi. Pi is the Greek letter that corresponds to P in English language or in Latin alphabet. P is for prices. It is the rate of change of general level of prices. I put that in scare quotes on purpose because what's general to you is different from what's general to me. In a sense, it is an index of cost of living of some sort. Typically, this is the most common one you would hear is the CPI inflation. CPI is short for Consumer Price Index. The way basically it's calculated. There's some sort of hypothetical basket of things that a household is thought of consuming, among these computer prices, potato prices, rent, or equivalent thereof, uh, whiskey prices, what have you. They all have different weights, gas prices, and so it is the rate of change of the cost of that basket over time. Even with CPI, there are different versions. For example, there is something called core CPI. It is the basket, but you take out things like food and energy costs out, because food and energy tends to be a lot more volatile Energy, especially because of the gas prices, tends to be pretty volatile. If this Iran-Israel thing lasts for a while, you could probably see gas prices around $4 pretty soon. But if it doesn't, it's going to remain at this level. But if inflation is very high because of that, that doesn't necessarily mean that overall cost of living is increasing, but that doesn't necessarily mean the price of coffee is going to increase. Yeah, it is going to be affected because everything is transported from somewhere to somewhere, but the effect is going to be relatively minimal. Food is also volatile. Why? It's affected by climate conditions. If there's a real big freeze, that's going to affect the orange harvest, and that's going to affect orange juice prices. Fed follows even a different one. It's called core implicit GDP price deflator, something like that. But over longer periods of time, they act in similar fashion. So whenever that inflation is high, we'd like to think that overall cost of living is increasing. It does not necessarily mean that you're having a more difficult time to make ends meet. That depends upon what's going on with your wages. For example, year 22 and quite a bit of 23, we had relatively high inflation, but the wages also kept up. In 2023, you couldn't find anybody to work in McDonald's for the minimum wage. In Kentucky, it happens to be 7.25, and I've seen Hardee's advertising they're paying $15 an hour. In some other states, it is already 15, but the federal level is 7.25, which hasn't changed over the last 10 years, I think. But states can do their own minimum wage. What we call real return, and we typically designate that with small case r. This is rate of return or yield after inflation is taken into account. Let's give a simple example. Suppose you have an instrument that's going to give you 10%. That could be stocks, bonds, what have you. And inflation rate is 0. That means you can expect the overall price level to remain constant. Next year, you will be able to buy 10% more of the things that you normally buy. So the real rate is going to be 10%. Now let's do an example. Suppose gas prices are $3 a gallon. In US number system, decimals are represented by point. In European with a comma, but I was raised in European, so sometimes I put comma. In fact, where we put comma, in US we write 1,000 for 1,000. In European system, you would write 1.000. And you have $300 that would buy you 100 gallons of gasoline. That would be in US. I mean, I was in England and Wales this summer for vacation. I think I paid around $7.50, $8 a gallon. They have more taxes, even though the cost of gas is probably cheaper because they're a lot closer to gas oil sources. and you have 10%. So next year, you will have $330, $300 of your original money, $30 in interest. Suppose this Iran-Israel thing uh, got more serious. I don't think it will, because Iranians kind of have to do it for their internal political purposes. Israelis are going to do some sort of response, but it's going to be measured because they have snap elections coming. If you thought that this uh, increase of activities in Lebanon is because of military reasons, you're very naive. Netanyahu has to have a reason to ask for people's vote after a year and a half of war in Gaza. Anyway, that's the political side. But suppose this thing increased and price went up to, let's call it $4. Now let's do $4, which is not uh, unimaginable if this thing continues for a while and escalates.